Hello, welcome to my channel. I'm Emily Rose and I'm a wildlife and pet portrait artist and a specialist in pastel pencils. In this video, you'll see me complete a recent commission of the lovely Bassett Hound, Delilah. I'm going to talk you through my process as the video goes on, but if you'd like a proper step-by-step lesson, then just visit my blog, which is linked down below. It's completely free, and on there are various lessons. I bring another one out every 2 weeks. You can also get discounts on your pencils. The materials that I'm going to use in this video are Clairefontaine pastel matte board. I love the pastel matte board because it's got a really great velvety texture and it just grabs the pastel, so you don't need to use a fixative at the end. I use a variety of pencils, including the Faber-Castell Pit Pastel pencils. And I also use a putty rubber. Putty rubbers are great for just cleaning up around the edges and removing any small blemishes or marks. Often you trail your hand over the painting and then it's smudged everywhere. I would advise, if you're going to do your own pastel portrait, that you first transfer your drawing onto the card before you begin, as any mistakes are quite difficult to properly rub out. If you'd like to know how to do that, you can just visit my blog and there's a step-by-step tutorial on there. I'm not sponsored by any of the materials I use, these are just what I like and how I get my best results. If you like this video, please comment below, like, share, subscribe, and I'll bring more to you. Okay, let's begin. So now that you've got all of your materials together, I'm just going to jump straight in here and start off with the eye. So I build up the eye in several layers. If you'd like to know more about how I do this, because obviously this is a very small eye to try and demonstrate with, hop over to my blog, the link's down below, and there's a full step-by-step tutorial on how to draw a dog's eye over there and all the materials that I would use, especially for a slightly bigger eye. But I always start with the eye because it sets up your tonal range for the painting, which is really important. This is how light and dark areas are, just think black and white. And it can actually be surprisingly difficult to see this as you're drawing in colour. Some colours appear to be really light or bright, such as a cadmium red. A lot of people would think that's quite a light colour, but actually it's just really intense and highly saturated, so it's got a lot of pigment in it, a lot of colour in it, but tonally it's pretty flat. It's about a tone 5 on a 1 to 10 tonal scale. So if you're struggling to see tone, and I certainly struggled to see tone because we like to see colour, it's very easy to see, just take your reference photo and turn it black and white, and then if you want to check your own work you can take a photo of that and turn that black and white too. It's really effective and it will just mean you can check your accuracy. So I'm just carrying on now with the second eye. Obviously there's a lot less to put in there, so it's more about getting it nice and dark so that it's sitting further back from us. And then I've just cleaned up around the edges quickly with the good old putty rubber. And I'm carrying on now with the underpainting, but you can see I'm adding a second layer to what is already down. I tend to use the side of the pencils to do this with. If you use the sides of your pencil, you get a softer application, which is really important because it just means that the layers sit together much better. You're not getting horrible jarring shading lines, but also if you think of your pastel mat, the tooth of your pastel mat, the tooth of the card is how much grain it's got to it. If you think of it like a box and you're filling it up as you go along with pastel, but if you start off really heavy on your bottom layers and you press really hard, you might fill your box 3/4 of the way up to the top before you've even got to your details, and then you're just not going to have enough space. And this basically means that when you've oversaturated your pastel mat, you'll find that the pastel sort of crumbles and falls off. It just can't hold anymore. I would advise personally against using a fixative to try and combat this. When I've experimented with fixatives before, you can get some change in coloration, but I also find that the pastel mat actually stains a little bit when I've done it. It sort of gets little speckles on it and you just don't need it. So I totally recommend working as I am doing here with blunted or the sides of pencils so you can get thin glazing layers, and then you can see that on the crown of her head now I've started to put in some details and it starts to come together quite quickly because the accuracy of the tone for the underpainting, how light and dark it is, was just about bang on underneath, so that the the highlights on top sit there really happily, and underneath there's a really great structure for them to sit on. So when I'm putting the underpainting in, you're looking for the darker colours or the darker shades beneath the bright hairs on top, and that's what you're colouring in first. So she will look slightly flat because you don't take it really bright, but she should have a good structure before you begin with the details. So for example, the snout should come forward, and it's really important, especially for a Basset Hound, to have a really great shadow between the eyes for the brow, so you can see that little strip of white that goes from her nose up to her forehead is actually quite grey, quite dark in the middle, because if I'd put the brighter colours in the middle, it would have forced that bit of bright white fur outwards and flattened her face, which would have been a real shame. So you've got to take it carefully when you're adding these brighter colours. Keep looking at your reference photo and just check that you're putting them in the correct places. So I am using a little bit of white here. I would say hold off on the white, especially if you're just beginning, until closer to the end, because it's quite easy to oversaturate your painting with it, and it will become quite flat if you've put too much white everywhere. Same as if you put too much black, it will become very flat. So I'm just adding a little bit more tonal structure to that left ear here, and I'm using a dark brown to do that with, cleaning up around the edges with the putty rubber. I'd advise doing that as you go along. Because this is a tutorial, I've tried not to use crystal paper here. Crystal paper is like a waxy paper that you can rest your hand on as you work, and it will stop the pastel underneath from being smudged, so it's really great. And then I'll protect all of my paintings when they're finished with the crystal paper before they go for framing. You can see that as I'm putting these highlights on, I'm not covering up all of the pastel. We need to be able to see some of this underpainting that we worked really hard on to come through. If we don't allow it to come through, then the highlights have got nothing to bounce off against. So you can see quite specifically in the folds above her eye here that I've allowed the underpainting to create almost two deep grooves between the fluffs of the brow. Same again for the eye that's closest to us, the right eye. There's some quite deep grooves coming down the side of her face there, and that's really describing the form of her face, and it's also allowing us to show some texture for the fur, the way the fur might sit, and that on these curves of her cheekbones that the fur might just jump out of the sides a little bit as well. So that's nice for a little bit of visual interest, but again, same as with the white pencil, and needing to be careful. If you oversaturated your painting with these lighter pencils, the whole thing just becomes light and it will become really quite flat. These brighter orange colours I actually use quite sparingly. A lot of the orange work that has been has been done with browns to start with. So it's the same principle again. Your brown is desaturated orange. It's not got very much colour in it. So that when we put these brighter colours on top with the oranges and the yellows, they shine out, appear to be much brighter than they actually are. So that's quite nice to have a play with when you're doing your own pet portraits. See that if you can have your underpainting a little bit more desaturated than you would take the top layer, that your top layer will appear brighter, and it just brings your painting alive quite a bit more. So I'm just fiddling about here with some of the details on her snout. When you're doing the details, and obviously I've had a few years experience now and learnt through a lot of trial and error, I wouldn't do what I'm doing at the minute, which is potentially overworking your details. You've really got to know how the pastel is going to behave. So I know for the different pencils I'm using and how much pastel I've got down, what I can get away with. But what you'll find is if you've put some details down, you're not quite happy with them and you keep overworking them, it comes back to thinking about your paper as a box and it's full. And you end up just sort of swirling all of this pastel together, and before you know it, you can't get any details on. And if you've been pressing hard, then if you take your putty rubber to these mistakes, you might actually find that as much as it will take some of the pastel off, you're left with a bit of a shadow, you can't get the same details on top
Now I think the reason for this is that the tooth of the card, if you feel the pastel mat, is almost velvety in texture, almost like got velvet fingers, like a carpet. If you're pressing quite hard, it crushes this structure down. So you could take some of the pastel out with your putty rubber, but it's not going to grip the pastel in the same way when you try to go back over these areas to rectify them. So this is where I just always encourage my students to work in lots of light layers. It's the best way to work, because if you do make mistakes, you can catch it before it becomes a real problem and just take it out again. I was just putting some details in there with an orange colour. Here it is again. This is an ochre dark by Creta Colour. I'm not sponsored by any of the materials, as I've said. These are just what I like to use. And Creta Colour are quite difficult to get hold of as individual pencils, but if you can find them, they do have some really lovely colours. You'll find that the different brands, although they do similar colours, they won't be quite the same, and that working them together just fills in some of the gaps in the colour wheel, so you can get more rounded paintings. And I do like the ochre selection that they've got. They've also got a lovely Bista colour and a lovely umber too, which is a nice dark brown that I find particularly good for transitioning from colour down into brown and then to black, because it's quite a flat brown colour that they've got. So I'm adding more structure here. These are for areas where I don't think the underpainting was quite dark enough, and I've started putting some of the lighter colours on top, and I think, nope, it needs something else to just really heighten that contrast, and you can see it's giving her ears much more structure. So when I'm adding the top details here on the forehead and both on her ear as well, I'm using pencils that are generally sharp, like the best of us. I do get a bit lazy with my sharpening sometimes. This pencil that I'm using right now, this yellow colour, it's one of the Derwent pencils, and it's quite brittle, and I find I actually can't sharpen it very well, so I've got quite adept at using the edge. But when I am putting the fur on top, generally a sharpened pencil, and I'll use an edge, and it's very important that you start with the pastel pencil off of the page, and then finish it with it off of the page as well. So the pencil sort of moves in a small arc shape, and this gives you really soft edges for your fur. If you want to know more about that, again, I've got another tutorial on my blog. It's actually of a peacock. And there are some details in there about how I manage the pencil. It does just come down to a lot of practice, but something I often see is that people start each first stroke with the pencil pressed onto the paper, and what this actually causes is a small splodge of pastel to almost break off, and you end up with these little dots all over your page, which are joined to little fur marks. So the best way to combat that is lots of practice, being gentle with the pencil and sort of stroking it on the page and off the page in an arc. So that's what I'm doing all over this whole project. Here I'm just adding in more of her shoulder, but you can see earlier on where I did her chest, you can really see how that underpainting has worked really well. It was the perfect tone, nice and dark, so that the lighter colours on top just sit there so well. The shadows in between them give great depth, and it looks very realistic because we get some great definition around the fur. And I do just tap back certain areas, which gently smudges them together. I just tap it with a clean finger, because too many details are actually quite distracting. I'm just finishing her off now with the shoulder here. Keep this nice and simple because the main focal area obviously is that beautiful eye, which is giving us all that character, and I'm just deepening some of the shadows that will finish her off. That's always the last thing I do. Go back to your darkest darks, go back to your lightest lights, just check that they're sitting nicely, because as I said at the beginning, they can pick up a little bit of dust and dull down. Both the darks and the lights can dull throughout the painting process. So I'm almost finished now, and she's really come together nicely. So I hope that you've enjoyed this tutorial, and if you'd like to see more, please comment down below. Here she is. So this is Delilah the Bassett Hound, done in pastel pencils, mostly Faber-Castell. You can find me at emilyrosefineart.co.uk. On Instagram, I'm Emily Rose Wildlife Art. I do also have Emily Rose Fine Art, but it's for my oil paintings. So if you want to see some different work from me, you can head over to Emily Rose Fine Art on Instagram. And I hope to see you again for another video. Please comment, like, and subscribe. Thank you very much.